Friday, June 28th, 2019, Maneco 64, home of alternative economics and contrarian views. Second video today, I want to talk about a really interesting interview that President Putin gave to the FT, specifically to the editor of the FT in Moscow, in the Kremlin. Lionel Barber, the editor of the FT, spent an hour and a half interviewing President Putin last night before Putin flew to Osaka in Japan for the G20. I have access to the FT. I've got the whole transcript of the interview. I'm going to go through some excerpts or some parts of the transcript that I think are really interesting. The general conclusion from the FT, from Lionel Barber, the editor of the FT who interviewed President Putin, is the following. Because there's a summary here of this, the whole interview in the FT itself. It says Vladimir Putin says liberalism has become obsolete. But there's some really more interesting parts of the interview that I want to go through with the viewers concerning, politics, geopolitics, and economics, globalization. And the first one is this one here from the interview. And I'll go through it. It's a question by Lionel Barber, and then the answer from Vladimir Putin, right? So here it is. Lionel Barber says, Mr. President, you are a student of history. You have had many hours of conversation with Henry Kissinger. You almost certainly read his book, World Order. With Mr. Trump, we have seen something new, something much more transactional. He's very critical of alliances and allies in Europe. Is this something that is to Russia's advantage? That's the question from Lionel Barber. And Vladimir Putin's answer is fairly long, and I'll go through it. And I think it's very interesting. It shows that Vladimir Putin is aware of what's going on in the West, how globalization has alienated the vast majority of the population, and it's only helped the elites. And President Putin notes that in his answer. So I'll go through his answer here. It says, and I'm quoting this, "It would be better to ask what would be to America's advantage in this case. Mr. Trump is not a career politician. He has a distinct world outlook and vision of U.S. national interests. I do not accept many of his methods when it comes to addressing problems. But do you know what I think?" He asked the question. "I think that he is a talented person. He knows very well what his voters accept from him. Russia has been accused, and strange as it may seem, it is still being accused, despite the Mueller report, of mythical interference in the U.S. election. What happened in reality?" He asks the question and goes on to answer, in his opinion, right? Says, "Mr. Trump looked into his opponent's attitude to him and saw changes in American society, and he took advantage of this." And he goes on, "You and I are talking ahead of the G20 meeting. It is an economic forum, and it will undoubtedly have discussions on globalization, global trade, and international finance. Has anyone ever given a thought to who actually benefited and what the benefits were gained from globalization, the development of which we have been observing and participating in over the past 25 years. Since the 1990s, he asked the question. He goes on to say, China has made use of globalization, in particular to pull millions of Chinese out of poverty. And he goes on, what happened in the US and how did it happen? And this is the interesting part, that he's willing to come out and tell it to the FT as it is. In the US, the leading US companies, their managers, shareholders, and partners, think about the 1%, I guess, made use of these benefits. The middle class hardly benefited from globalization. The take-home pay in the US, the middle class in the US has not benefited from globalization. It was left out when this pie was divided up, and that's the key there. And he goes on to say the Trump team sensed this very keenly and clearly, and they used this in the election campaign. It is where you should look for reasons behind Trump's victory, rather than in any alleged foreign interference. This is what we should be talking about here, including when it comes to the global economy. I believe this may explain his seemingly extravagant economic decisions and even his relations with his partners and allies. He believes that the distribution of resources and benefits of globalization in the past decade was unfair to the US. I am not going to discuss whether it was fair or not, and I will not say if what he is doing is right or wrong. I would like to understand his motives, which is what you asked me about. Maybe this could explain his unusual behavior. So there you go. I thought that was a great answer. Am I trying to defend President Trump here? No. Am I trying to defend President Putin? No. I'm just trying to show you that Putin is aware of why we're having these political movements, why Trump was elected. It wasn't because of Russian meddling, right? It was because the general public is dissatisfied. You know, as Putin noted, globalization has benefited very few in the West. It has benefited millions in other countries like China, but not the US. And I thought this was an interesting question and an even more interesting answer by President Putin. So let's go through some more questions and answers. This is more about geopolitics, not, globalization and economics. And I thought this was really interesting. It's to do with Venezuela and what's been happening there this year. This is the question from Lionel Barber. He says, Mr. President, does that same argument apply to Venezuela? In other words, you are not prepared to see a transition in Venezuela, and you are absolutely committed to President Maduro. And then this is what Vladimir Putin answers. Oh, and it seemed we had started so well. Please do not take offense to what I'm going to say next. You won't, will you? We were off to such a terrific start, talking seriously, and now you have moved back to the stereotype views on Russia. We have nothing to do with what is happening in Venezuela, if you know what I mean. And then Lionel Barber asks another question. What are those advisors doing then in Caracas? And this is what Putin answers. He says, I will say this now, if you just let me finish. There is no problem with that. And he goes on to say, back under President Hugo Chavez, we sold weapons to Venezuela without any limits and problems. We did this absolutely legally, just as it's done all around the world, and as every country does, including the US, the UK, China, and France. We did this too. We sold weapons to Venezuela. We signed contracts which say that we signed contracts which say what we have to do when it comes to servicing this military equipment. That we must train local specialists, ensure that this equipment is maintained in combat readiness, and so on. We provide maintenance services for this equipment. I have already said this many times, including to our American partners. There are no Russian troops there. Do you understand? Yes, there are Russian specialists and instructors there. Yes, they're working there. Only recently, I believe it was a week ago, a group of our advisors and specialists left the country. But they can return. And he continues. We have an agreement that our aircraft fly there from time to time to take part in exercises. And this is it. Are we regulating the rebels' actions as some of our partners are doing, or the actions of President Maduro? He is president. Why should we control his actions? He's in control. Whether he is doing well or not, this is another matter altogether. We do not make any judgments. I believe that many things could have been done differently there when it comes to the economy, but we do not meddle in things. It is none of our business. We have invested billions of dollars there, mostly in the oil sector. So what? Other countries are doing the same as well. He goes on to say, it looks like everything is preserved only by Russian weapons. This is not true. It has nothing in common with reality. Where are the self-proclaimed presidents and opposition leaders? Some of them have taken refuge in foreign embassies and others are in hiding. What do we have to do with this? This problem should be sorted out by the Venezuelan people themselves. This is all. The other interesting thing that he talked about was about the Russian investments in Venezuela. And this is what he says, and I quote, "By the way, we worked with President Chavez because he was president. We did not work with President Chavez as an individual, but we worked with Venezuela. That is why we channeled investments in the oil sector." And he goes on to say, this is the really interesting part here. "And where did we plan to deliver Venezuelan oil while investing in the oil sector?" Question. As you know, Venezuela has unique oil that is mostly delivered to U.S. refineries. What is so bad about that? We wanted the Venezuelan oil and gas sector to operate steadily, predictably, and confidently, and to make deliveries to those U.S. refineries. I do not understand what is so wrong with this. So there you go. He's actually saying, Russian companies, oil sector, invest billions in Venezuela to do business, to actually help Venezuela export oil to the U.S. So there's a lot more in this interview, but I thought that those two excerpts there for me were really interesting. The other interesting point he makes, because Lionel Barber asks him about the China-Russian relationship, because Lionel Barber and the Western propaganda, of course, think that China and Russia are ganging up against the rest of the world, especially the United States. But President Putin says that it's nothing to do with ganging up with other countries. He says they've been cooperating since 2001, collaborating through trade, economics, finance, different sectors of relationship. And that's what they're trying to do. They're not trying to, gang up against anyone. They're just trying to cooperate. And that's what Russia wants to do with other countries. So I thought that was really interesting. The other point he made was because Lionel Barber asked about the Skripal case, the Russian spy that was supposedly, poisoned by Russian agents. And whether that would, hurt Russian-UK relations. And what President Putin said is that it's silly to, base interstate relations like the UK and Russia on these spy cases. He says that traitors like Skripal should be punished, and that he was punished. He was in prison for 5 years, and then he was released. And if he were going to punish a spy, he would certainly not do it like, it was supposedly done in the UK, in Salisbury, right? The Skripal case. So very interesting. If you have access to the FT, I recommend that you do read the excerpt, go through their conclusion as well, or their summary of the interview. FT, has focused on this comment that Putin made that liberalism has become obsolete. And he's got a point, and it's become obsolete because as Putin said in an interview, the Western elite, they're not they're serving the general public. They're not doing things to for the general welfare of the general public. Yeah, there was another question, interesting question actually, that Lionel Barber asked about the Russian oligarchs. And Putin said, we don't have oligarchs anymore because that would mean that the Russian state would be giving favoritism for certain companies. And he said, we don't do that anymore. He said the Russian state does deal with public companies, but not as it was under the oligarchs. And I think he's got a point there. You know, why aren't the bankers in the West, on Wall Street, in the city of London and Frankfurt, called oligarchs? Putin didn't note that, of course, but I'm noting that. So what's my conclusion from this interview that I think is a must-read for people who want to know, you know, what's going on out there in geopolitical terms? I think it just goes to show that when you talk to President Putin, he actually says it like it is. There's no propaganda. And I wonder how well this interview will be taken, and what most people will take out of it probably is that, you know, they're going to focus on this liberalism becoming obsolete. Will they actually focus on President Putin's answer about globalization, how it's only benefited a few in the West? If you enjoy this synopsis of this FT interview, make sure you hit the like button. If you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, make sure you do. You can also follow me on Twitter, Steemit, and on DTube. I wish you all a great rest of the day. Take care. Bye.